On the surface, the Harpers seemed like the quintessential suburban family. Their home, nestled in the quiet town of Ridgefield, Connecticut, was an elegant two-story house with a perfectly manicured lawn and white picket fence. Linda Harper, 49, was a devoted housewife who spent her days ensuring everything was in its proper place. Her husband, Daniel Harper, 52, was a successful attorney whose demanding job often kept him away from home. Together, they had 2 children, Emma, a bright and ambitious 17-year-old preparing for her college applications, and Josh, a spirited 15-year-old who lived for the thrill of soccer matches. From the outside, the Harpers' life seemed picture-perfect, but as with most things, appearances were deceiving. Linda had once been the heart of the Harper household, her laughter filling every corner of the home. But over the years, that vibrant energy faded. Daniel, though a reliable provider, had become a ghost in their marriage. He was always preoccupied, his mind tethered to case files and court deadlines. Their conversations were reduced to logistical exchanges about bills, school schedules, and the occasional grumble over a malfunctioning dishwasher. The breaking point came on their 20th wedding anniversary. Linda had planned a quiet evening to commemorate their years together, a candlelit dinner, a slideshow of family memories, and a heartfelt letter expressing her longing to reconnect. But Daniel never showed. He called hours later, apologizing in a distracted tone, claiming he was tied up with a critical case. Linda sat at the dinner table, her untouched meal growing cold, the flickering candlelight a cruel reminder of the emptiness she felt. For the first time, she wondered if Daniel even saw her anymore or if she had become an invisible fixture in their once loving marriage. It was during this emotional drought that Evan Clark re-entered her life. The Clarks lived just 2 houses down, and Linda had known their son, Evan, since he was a lanky teenager mowing lawns for extra cash. But when she saw him again in June 2022, he was no longer the awkward boy from years ago. At 19, Evan had grown into a confident and striking young man. His athletic build and casual charm made him hard to ignore. Their first real encounter happened one humid afternoon as Linda tended to her garden. Evan, shirtless and tanned from the summer sun, was fixing a sprinkler in his parents' yard. He noticed her struggling with a bag of mulch and rushed over to help. "Need a hand, Mrs. Harper?" he asked, his voice smooth yet playful. Linda blushed at the attention. "Oh, thank you, Evan. These things feel heavier every year." Their conversation was light, weather, neighborhood gossip, his college plans, but it left Linda feeling something she hadn't felt in years, seen. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone noticed her, appreciated her, even admired her. As the days passed, their interactions became more frequent. Evan would wave at her from across the street or stop by to ask if she needed help around the house. Linda found herself lingering near the windows, watching for him, her heart fluttering in a way that both excited and terrified her. By mid-June, Linda couldn't deny the spark that had ignited between them. It was a dangerous, forbidden energy that filled the void Daniel had left behind. Evan wasn't just a young man from down the street anymore, he was her escape from a life that had become too predictable, too lonely. But little did Linda know, the cracks in her seemingly perfect life were about to widen into a chasm, threatening to swallow her entire world. It began with a simple favor. On the morning of June 25, 2022, Linda Harper stood in her kitchen, staring at a flickering light above the sink. Frustration welled up as she realized she'd have to call an electrician, another expense Daniel would grumble about but ultimately ignore. Before she could pick up her phone, a knock at the back door startled her. It was Evan Clark, his easy grin lighting up the doorway. "Morning, Mrs. Harper. Thought I'd check in to see if you need anything. My parents said you've been doing some renovations," he offered casually, leaning against the doorframe. Linda hesitated, then gestured toward the problematic light. "Actually, this is probably a long shot, but do you know anything about fixing a bad socket? It's been driving me crazy." Evan smirked. "Lucky for you, I've picked up a few tricks in college. Let me grab my toolbox. Minutes later, Evan was on a step stool in the small kitchen, his arms stretched overhead as he fiddled with the wiring. Linda couldn't help but notice how the muscles in his forearms flexed as he worked. She scolded herself silently for the thoughts creeping into her mind, but when Evan looked down, catching her gaze, there was a moment, just a flicker, where something unspoken passed between them. "There we go," Evan announced, hopping down and testing the switch. The light stopped flickering. "Good as new." Linda smiled warmly. "Thank you, Evan. You just saved me a call to the electrician." "It's nothing," he replied, his tone softer now, his eyes lingering on hers just a second too long. "Happy to help." That moment might have been the end of it, but as Linda walked him to the door, a light drizzle began outside. Evan glanced at the sky, then back at her. "Looks like I'll wait out the rain if that's okay." The atmosphere shifted. Alone in the quiet house, with rain tapping against the windows, the space between them grew charged. Evan leaned casually against the counter, his confident smile never wavering. "You know, you work way too hard. I see you out in the garden every day, running errands. Do you ever get a break, Mrs. Harper?" Linda laughed lightly, a defense against the vulnerability his words evoked. "That's just part of the job, keeping things running while everyone else is too busy to notice." His gaze held hers. "Well, someone should notice." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Linda felt her breath catch. Before she could think, before she could weigh the consequences, Evan leaned in. His lips brushed hers, tentative at first, then with growing intensity. Linda didn't pull away. Instead, she gave in, briefly, desperately, to the rush of feeling alive again. Over the next few weeks, their encounters became more frequent and deliberate. Evan would text her in the mornings, simple messages that made her smile, "Need any help today?" or "You looked beautiful yesterday." She found herself deleting the messages almost immediately, not because she regretted them, but because the secrecy added a thrill she hadn't felt in years. Evan began visiting more often, under the guise of offering help with chores. He fixed a squeaky cabinet door, trimmed the hedges, and even cleaned the gutters. But these were just excuses. Their stolen moments grew bolder, from lingering touches to heated embraces in the quiet corners of the house. When Daniel was at work, they had the house to themselves, and their meetings became reckless and consuming. Linda felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt. Every glance from Evan, every whispered compliment, chipped away at her resolve. Yet, in the quiet of the night, as she lay beside Daniel, she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of betrayal. Meanwhile, Evan's infatuation deepened. He began texting more often, sometimes late at night, asking Linda if she was thinking of him. He seemed unbothered by the risks, even daring to hold her hand as they walked briefly together in the local park, a secluded corner where no one would notice. But Linda noticed. Her heart raced not from excitement, but from fear of discovery. By mid-July, the cracks in Linda's secret began to widen. On the evening of July 15th, as Evan slipped out of the Harper house after another stolen moment, he didn't notice Mrs. Grant sitting on her porch 2 houses down. The elderly neighbor, with her sharp eyes and an instinct for neighborhood drama, watched intently as Evan hurried across the driveway and disappeared into the night. Suspicious, she made a mental note to keep a closer watch on the Harper household. Linda, oblivious to the scrutiny, convinced herself that no one suspected anything. But as her connection with Evan intensified, so did the weight of her deception. What began as a fleeting escape had become an affair spiraling dangerously out of control, with consequences Linda couldn't yet foresee. The rainstorm that began that first fateful encounter hadn't ended, it was only gathering strength, ready to tear through everything in its path. By late July, Linda Harper's carefully constructed world was beginning to fray. The thrill of her secret meetings with Evan Clark had turned into a tangled web of lies, half-truths, and a gnawing fear of discovery. But the danger wasn't just in her mind, others were beginning to notice. On the evening of July 20th, Mrs. Grant, the Harpers' observant elderly neighbor, sat on her porch sipping tea as the summer breeze cooled the air. She prided herself on knowing the comings and goings of the neighborhood, and something about Evan's late-night visits to the Harper house didn't sit right with her. That night, she saw him leave Linda's house just after 10 p.m., glancing nervously over his shoulder before darting across the driveway. Mrs. Grant's curiosity grew. By the next day, she had snapped a few photos of Evan arriving at the Harper home in the middle of the afternoon. Armed with these images, she decided to send an anonymous letter to Daniel Harper, carefully including her evidence, a grainy photo of Evan standing at the back door. The letter arrived on July 30th, nestled among the usual bills and advertisements. Daniel Harper opened the plain envelope at his office, his brow furrowing as he read the typed message. "Your wife has been receiving frequent visits from a much younger man. I thought you should know. A concerned neighbor." The attached photo was blurry but unmistakable. Daniel recognized Evan Clark immediately. At first, he dismissed the accusation. Linda wasn't perfect, but she was loyal. He reasoned that Evan might simply be helping with odd jobs around the house. Yet, as he sat alone in his office, replaying moments from the past few weeks, tiny details began to surface: Linda's phone buzzing late at night, the sudden repairs she claimed she'd handled herself, and the faint scent of cologne lingering in their bedroom, one that wasn't his. That evening, Daniel returned home earlier than usual. Linda greeted him with her usual smile, but something about her demeanor felt off. He couldn't place it, but a nagging voice in his head urged him to look deeper. Over the next few days, Daniel began observing Linda more closely. He noticed how she seemed distracted during dinner, her phone always turned face down on the table. When he asked her about her day, her answers were vague, her voice slightly too bright, as if she were overcompensating. By August 10th, Daniel's suspicions had reached a boiling point. Unable to confront Linda directly, he hired a private investigator, someone he trusted to dig into the truth without causing a scene. The investigator wasted no time, and within days, Daniel had his answer. Photos and detailed reports confirmed his worst fears: Linda was having an affair with Evan Clark. The investigator captured images of the two at a secluded corner of Main Street Park, their heads close as they spoke, and another of Evan slipping into the Harper home while Daniel was at work. The evidence was undeniable. Daniel sat in his car outside his office, the photos spread out on the passenger seat. His hands trembled as a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief coursed through him. How could Linda, the woman he had built a life with, do this to him? The image of Evan's smug, youthful face ignited a fury Daniel hadn't felt in years. On the evening of August 15th, Daniel decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He waited until Emma and Josh were upstairs in their rooms before calling Linda into the living room. She entered cautiously, sensing the tension in his voice. "Sit down," Daniel said, his tone cold and unfamiliar. He placed the photos on the coffee table between them, each one a silent accusation. Linda's breath caught as she looked down. Her worst fear had come true. "Explain this," Daniel demanded, his voice low but firm. Linda hesitated, her mind racing for an excuse, but she knew there was no way out. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I'm sorry." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Sorry? That's all you have to say? You've been sneaking around behind my back, with him?" His voice cracked, the pain cutting through his anger. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Linda pleaded, her voice breaking. "I was lonely, Daniel. You've been so distant, and I—" "Don't you dare blame this on me," he interrupted, standing abruptly. "I've been working my ass off for this family, for you, and this is how you repay me?" Linda tried to explain, but every word seemed to make it worse. Finally, she admitted the truth: she had ended things with Evan a week ago, realizing the danger and the mistake she'd made. But Daniel couldn't see past the betrayal. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Linda sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her chest heaving with silent sobs. She had destroyed the trust that once held their family together. What she didn't realize was that the storm was far from over. Evan, hurt and obsessed, was about to take matters into his own hands. The days following the confrontation were suffocatingly tense in the Harper household. Daniel and Linda barely spoke, their once comfortable silences now brimming with unspoken resentment and hurt. Emma and Josh sensed the tension, but their parents brushed off their concerns, insisting it was just work stress. What they didn't know was that beneath the surface, a much darker storm was brewing. Evan Clark had not taken the breakup lightly. Linda's decision to end their affair a week prior had left him feeling betrayed and humiliated. He became increasingly erratic, flooding Linda's phone with messages ranging from desperate pleas for reconciliation to veiled threats. "You can't just throw me away like this," one text read. "If I can't have you, maybe your husband should know the truth." Linda had tried to block his number, but Evan found ways around it, creating new accounts or leaving handwritten notes in her mailbox. She began to feel trapped, the thrill of their secret romance now replaced with a paralyzing fear. She considered telling Daniel about the threats, but the thought of reopening those wounds made her hesitate. She hoped Evan would eventually let go. She was wrong. On the night of August 30th, Daniel Harper was home late, nursing a whiskey in the dimly lit living room. The weight of betrayal still hung heavy on his shoulders, and his trust in Linda was shattered. Upstairs, Linda lay awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of crickets outside doing little to soothe her fraying nerves. Neither of them knew that Evan was lurking just outside the house, his mind consumed by a dangerous mix of jealousy and rage. In his hand, he clutched a heavy wrench, taken from his father's garage earlier that evening. To him, the wrench wasn't just a tool, it was a means to reclaim what he believed was his. At 11:15 p.m., Evan crept around the side of the Harper home, his sneakers silent against the dewy grass. He knew the layout of the house well, having been inside countless times. The back door, he remembered, had a faulty latch. Quietly, he slipped inside. Linda jolted upright in bed, her heart pounding as she thought she heard the faint creak of the back door. She strained to listen, her breath shallow, but the house fell silent again. Telling herself it was her imagination, she lay back down, oblivious to the shadow moving through the halls. Downstairs, Daniel heard it too, the soft scrape of footsteps. His hand instinctively reached for the baseball bat he kept by the couch. He stood, muscles tense, listening for any sound out of place. When a figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway, Daniel's voice was sharp and commanding. "Who's there?" Evan stepped forward into the dim light of the living room. His face was flushed, his grip on the wrench tightening. "You ruined everything," he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. Daniel's eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. "Evan," he said, incredulous. "What the hell are you doing here? You don't deserve her." Evan shouted, his voice cracking. "You've neglected her, ignored her. She was mine, and you took her away." Daniel's jaw clenched, his fury bubbling to the surface. "Get out of my house," he growled, gripping the bat tighter. But Evan didn't move. Instead, he raised the wrench, his intent clear. The fight was brief but violent. Evan lunged, swinging the wrench with a force that grazed Daniel's shoulder. Pain shot through him, but adrenaline took over as he swung the bat in retaliation, striking Evan's side. The younger man stumbled but didn't stop, his obsession driving him forward. Linda, hearing the commotion, raced downstairs just in time to see Evan lunge at Daniel again, the wrench aimed for his head. "Stop," she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. In the chaos, Daniel swung the bat again, harder this time. The blow connected with a sickening thud to Evan's temple. He collapsed to the floor, the wrench clattering beside him. Linda froze, her hands covering her mouth as she stared at Evan's lifeless body sprawled across the hardwood floor. Daniel stood over him, chest heaving, the bat slipping from his grip as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. His gaze met Linda's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The house was eerily silent except for the distant sound of crickets outside. Linda fell to her knees, trembling as she checked Evan's pulse. "He's dead," she whispered, her voice hollow. Daniel staggered back, his legs giving out as he sank into the couch. The weight of the moment crushed them both. "You have to call the police," Linda said finally, her voice barely audible. Daniel shook his head, his mind racing. "They'll think I killed him on purpose," he muttered. "Self-defense doesn't matter when you're holding the bat." But Linda insisted, knowing they couldn't hide what had happened. Minutes later, Daniel made the call. His voice was calm but strained as he told the dispatcher, "I've just killed someone. He broke into my house." As the blue and red lights of police cars illuminated the Harper home, Linda watched from the porch, her hands shaking. Inside, Daniel sat silently, staring at the bat still lying on the floor. In the end, the affair that had once made Linda feel alive had left her family broken in ways she could never have imagined. Evan's obsession, Daniel's anger, and her own mistakes had collided in the most tragic way possible, and the consequences were only beginning. In the days following the tragedy, the Harper household became the epicenter of chaos and despair. Police officers swarmed the scene, their radios crackling with terse instructions as crime scene investigators meticulously documented the aftermath. The once pristine living room was now a grim tableau, shattered furniture, blood stains on the floor, and the wrench that had fallen from Evan's lifeless hand. Linda stood frozen on the porch, clutching a blanket an officer had draped over her shoulders. Daniel sat in the back of a squad car, his head bowed, hands cuffed, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. By September 5th, the Harper family's private nightmare had become a public spectacle. The small town of Ridgefield buzzed with gossip and judgment. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating on the details of the scandal that had unfolded in the seemingly perfect Harper household. The name Evan Clark was on everyone's lips, his photo plastered across local news outlets alongside headlines like "Deadly Love Triangle in Ridgefield" and "Lawyer's Suburban Life Turns to Tragedy." At the police station, Daniel gave his statement, recounting the events of that fateful night with a measured calm that belied the storm raging inside him. "I acted in self-defense," he insisted, his voice firm yet hollow. The investigation corroborated his story, the broken lock on the back door, the wrench Evan had brought with him, and the clear signs of a struggle all painted a picture of a man protecting his home. But intent didn't absolve him of the consequences. On October 1st, Daniel appeared in court, the weight of the trial bearing down on him. Linda sat in the gallery, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. The prosecutor argued that while Daniel had acted in self-defense, his use of force was excessive. The defense countered that Daniel had no choice but to defend himself against a dangerous intruder. The jury deliberated for hours before delivering their verdict, guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The judge, acknowledging the extenuating circumstances, sentenced Daniel to 2 years in prison. Linda, too, faced consequences. Her affair and her silence about Evan's increasingly erratic behavior led to a charge of accessory after the fact. She was given a suspended sentence, but the damage to her reputation was irreparable. While Daniel awaited transfer to a correctional facility, Linda returned home to face the wreckage of their lives. Emma and Josh, once bright and carefree, now carried the heavy burden of their family's disgrace. Emma, a model student and class leader, found herself ostracized at school. Whispers followed her in the hallways, and friends distanced themselves, unsure how to navigate the scandal. Josh, once the star of the soccer team, was benched indefinitely as coaches and teammates alike struggled to reconcile his family's turmoil with their sense of camaraderie. At home, the tension was unbearable. Josh lashed out at Linda, his anger raw and unfiltered. "This is your fault," he shouted one evening, his voice cracking. "You ruined everything." Emma, more withdrawn, barely spoke to her mother, her silence a constant reminder of Linda's guilt. Linda tried to reach out to her children, but they were drowning in their own pain. At night, she lay awake in the empty bed she once shared with Daniel, haunted by the choices that had led to this point. The affair that had made her feel alive now left her family fractured and exposed to the scorn of the world. Determined to rebuild what she had broken, Linda took the first step toward healing by enrolling her children in therapy. She joined them for sessions, sitting quietly as they vented their anger and sorrow. Slowly, through the guidance of counselors, Emma and Josh began to process their grief and the betrayal they felt. Linda also visited Daniel in prison every week. Their conversations were initially strained, filled with long silences and curt exchanges. But over time, the distance between them began to close. They talked about their shared responsibility for what had happened, about the cracks in their marriage that had led them to this breaking point. Slowly, they found moments of connection, fragile but genuine. When Daniel was released 2 years later, the Harpers made a difficult decision, to leave Richfield and start over in a new town. They sold their home, packed their belongings, and moved to a small community in upstate New York, far from the whispers and judgment that had haunted them in Richfield. In their new home, the Harpers began to rebuild, not just their lives, but their relationships with each other. Daniel and Linda committed to open communication, addressing the wounds in their marriage with honesty and vulnerability. They learned to prioritize their family, to carve out time for each other, and to confront problems before they festered. Emma and Josh, though scarred by the experience, began to find their footing again. Emma excelled in her new school, channeling her pain into her studies and community service. Josh rediscovered his love for soccer, playing with a passion fueled by a desire to reclaim the joy he had lost. Linda, too, found solace in her journey toward self-forgiveness. She knew she couldn't erase the past, but she could choose to live differently moving forward. Her affair had shattered her family, but their collective resilience had pieced them back together, stronger and more united. The Harper family's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how even the strongest-looking structures can collapse under the weight of secrets and neglect. But it also offered hope, that redemption is possible, even in the face of profound loss. Through their pain, the Harpers learned the importance of honesty, communication, and the enduring strength of family. And though the scars of their tragedy would never fully fade, they carried forward with a renewed commitment to one another, determined to never let the cracks grow unnoticed again. As the Harper family settled into their new life in upstate New York, the echoes of their past still lingered, but the quiet of their surroundings provided a much-needed respite. Their new home, a modest one-story house surrounded by trees, was far removed from the prying eyes of Richfield. Here, they could begin again, away from the whispers and judgment that had once defined their every step. For Daniel, life after prison was a humbling adjustment. The man who once strode confidently through courtrooms now found himself working part-time at a small law firm, far from the high-stakes cases he used to handle. But there was a quiet dignity in starting over. Each morning, as he brewed coffee for Linda and kissed her cheek before leaving for work, he reminded himself that rebuilding trust was a slow process. He could see the hurt in her eyes, but also the hope. Linda, too, was learning to forgive herself. Therapy sessions helped her confront the deep-rooted insecurities that had driven her into Evan's arms. She had come to understand that her affair wasn't just a betrayal of Daniel but a desperate response to the loneliness she'd let fester for years. Now, she made it a point to speak openly with Daniel, to address the small fractures in their relationship before they could deepen into chasms. She volunteered at a local community center, finding purpose in helping others rebuild their lives, much as she was rebuilding her own. Emma and Josh were healing in their own ways. Emma threw herself into her studies, earning a scholarship to a nearby university where she studied psychology, perhaps, in part, to understand the emotional chaos that had torn through her family. Josh, ever the athlete, joined a local soccer team, his talent shining once again. Though the scars of their family's tragedy lingered, they were learning to trust their parents and themselves again. The Harpers' story was not one of easy redemption. The pain they had endured and the mistakes they had made could not be erased. But it became a story of resilience, of the quiet strength it takes to move forward when the weight of guilt and grief feels unbearable. Linda often found herself reflecting on the past, the moments where everything could have gone differently. If only she had spoken up sooner about her loneliness. If only Daniel had noticed the cracks forming between them. If only she had recognized the danger in Evan's infatuation before it spiraled out of control. But dwelling on if-onlys wouldn't change the present. Instead, she chose to focus on what they had now, a family that had been broken but not destroyed, a marriage that was scarred but still standing. On a chilly fall evening, as the family sat around a small bonfire in their backyard, Emma looked at her parents and asked, "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" Daniel's hand found Linda's, their fingers intertwining. "Normal might look different for us now," he said, his voice steady. "But as long as we stick together, we'll be okay." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was enough. The Harper family's story is a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect lives can unravel when trust and communication are neglected. But it also shows that healing is possible, even after profound loss and betrayal. What do you think of Linda's choices? Could she have avoided the tragedy if she had spoken up sooner? Was Daniel right to defend himself the way he did? And what about Evan? Was he a victim of his own obsession, or was he always a danger to the family? We'd love to hear your thoughts. What lessons do you take from this story? Do you believe the Harpers will ever fully recover? Share your opinions in the comments below and let us know how you'd handle a situation like this. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales of human drama and resilience. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll explore another shocking true crime story. See you next time.